At the dawn of the 21st century, there were more democratic governments around the world than ever before. But by 2025, the network of politically free societies and economies has come under increasing threat on every continent amid the spread of extremism and the rise of authoritarian powers challenging U.S. leadership around the globe. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencer Series, we're joined by Daniel Twining, the president of the International Republican Institute, or IRI, a U.S. nonprofit organization whose core mission is to support and promote democracy worldwide. Dan, you're a prolific writer, an advocate of international political freedom, and you've worked for more than 2 decades toward the goal of establishing open, fair, and accountable democratic leadership from Africa to Asia to Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Guy. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Let's jump right into this. The international leadership and influence of U.S. democracy and free market idealism is being challenged by an alignment of great power autocracies, specifically China and Russia. How does that impact the need for U.S.-led democracy promotion around the world?
I think Americans need to understand a fundamental proposition, which is that the world America made is under assault. These authoritarian adversaries of the United States, this axis of aggressors, are working to dismantle the free and open world that underlies our freedom and our security and our prosperity at home. They're working together in unprecedented ways. Now, most people in the world want to live in freedom under the rule of law. Most people in the world don't want to live under the control of a totalitarian empire, China, Russia, etc. So we have real work to do. These countries, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine accepted, these aggressors are not using kinetic instruments. They are using strategic corruption, co-optation, forms of economic and information warfare to try to move countries into their column, to take away the freedoms of those countries' citizens and get them to answer to a malign foreign power. So the work that IRI does around the world is designed to help people secure their freedom, secure their sovereignty, and make their own choices, including about being great friends and allies of the United States.
Well, we're at kind of an interesting moment domestically here, where one of the first moves that the new Trump administration has made was to order a 90-day freeze on nearly all U.S. government funding for foreign aid. A significant portion of IRI's funding comes from the U.S. government. Why is that funding so important, and how confident are you that it's going to be restored quickly?
So we support a review of foreign assistance. We think it's appropriate for a new administration to come in and look at where that money is going. Does it align with U.S. interests? Is it strategic? Is it valuable? We welcome that. Our programs will pass that test. One thing we don't want to do is take Team America off the field. These democracy instruments are not only strategic in terms of standing up to the Chinese Communist Party or Iranian or Russian or Cuban depredations, but we also know that countries that can govern themselves decently and justly don't export mass migration to the United States. They don't inculcate violent extremism that comes home to attack us like it did on 9/11. And they don't try to invade and swallow their neighbors like Russia's doing in Ukraine. So these investments in democracy that the foreign aid budget supports, the foreign aid budget, by the way, is less than 1% of the overall U.S. budget. These investments actually are very strategic for U.S. national interests if focused and targeted.
Let's talk a little bit more about what IRI actually does. And let's, within the context of Trump's America First dogma, how do democracy promotion efforts overseas deliver for the American taxpayer? How do they advance the U.S. national interest?
So, by helping countries stand on their own 2 feet, govern themselves decently and justly, they solve a whole host of problems for America. I'm going to take Venezuela as Exhibit A. There's so many examples. Venezuela was the richest country in South America. It was a democracy. Its people were free and prosperous. Over the last 20, 25 years, it devolved into kleptocracy, strongman rule under first Chavez and then Maduro, actively supported by China, Russia, and Cuba. Okay, Venezuela has exported 1/4 of its population, many of them to the United States as desperate refugees. Over the last 7 years, the U.S. has spent $3.5 billion with a B on humanitarian assistance to Venezuelan refugees. That number would be 0 if Venezuela was still a functioning democracy, right? So that's one example of how we save money. Our best friends and allies in the world are democracies. When we think about Team America, when we think about the free world, those countries, again, do not have autocratic tendencies. They do not foment extremism. The Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, we were there. President Trump's convention platform talked about peace through strength. We get peace. Democracies are peaceful. They don't act like Russia, China, Iran. Strength. America is strong in large part because we have dozens of allied democracies. Think about Japan, Korea, Australia, NATO, etc. The Trump national security strategy from the first Trump administration talked about deploying American influence, the toolkit, the non-kinetic toolkit to advance American values, and that tied right back to freedom and security for the American people in the homeland.
When you bring up Venezuela, I think people who are aware of organizations like IRI or are aware of IRI think, what does the organization do? Is it supporting free civil society organizations in other countries? What specifically is IRI doing in Venezuela?
So we're just broadly, because it's different in different countries, but we're working to train political parties to be competitive, to win elections based on platforms, not personalities, and then to govern based on those platforms. We help them with polling so that politicians understand what their citizens want, and when they win, can deliver on that. We get people involved in politics. Women, young people, rising leaders, so that countries are not governed by the same old set of old-fashioned guys, right? We work with civic activists who want to stand up to tyranny and dictatorship in their countries and spotlight corruption. Brave men and women who are fighting for democratic space. We also help dissidents in closed societies get around all the cyber surveillance. We give them tools so that they can organize themselves to stand up to the enemies of America.
What we're really talking about here is soft power projection. If the U.S. government shuts off funding or the juice behind that, isn't there a risk that China fills the void, particularly vis-a-vis the global South? And help me unpack the danger of that over the coming 25 years.
For sure. So we've seen the Chinese come in not only in far-flung places in Africa, but very close to home, right here in Central America, in South America, in our own hemisphere. And they have a proposition. It can involve economic inducement. It can involve economic coercion. It can involve forms of political corruption. It involves information manipulation. They're very good at this. And their goal is to wean pro-American countries away from us and into their camp, or to neutralize them, so that when the United States needs help or support, those countries will say, well, I better not do that because it will upset Beijing. They've also done this with some of our closest friends and allies. In Australia, the Chinese Communist Party insinuated itself into the political funding infrastructure for the Australian political parties. The Australian intelligence establishment ran the alarm and the system woke up. Even advanced democracies like Australia are very susceptible to these forms of seduction and subversion by malign actors like China. So the work that IRI does is about helping countries protect themselves, build resilience. When you have democratic and accountable institutions, when you have free elections, rule of law, free media that can tell the story about these forms of corruption and inducement, citizens hate it. China was a big election issue in Zambia in their last election, in Kenya in their last election. It's been an election issue in the Maldives, countries around the world. When these things are surfaced, citizens say, no way. I want my government to answer to me as a voter and not to a foreign power.
Help us understand the costs of soft power tools like democracy promotion as compared to hard power defense funding. Are we talking about comparable funding here, or is it really a tiny drop in the bucket for soft power?
It's tiny. Thank you for asking. I'm all for raising the defense budget. It's a dangerous world. We need hard power to restore deterrence that fell apart during the Biden administration. But in fact, we've had 4-star generals say to us, you know what? Where IRI succeeds, the Army, the Marines don't need to fight. We are your biggest champions because you can help people solve problems through local agency and good government that prevent countries from tipping over to the point where suddenly they turn into a situation that requires a U.S. national security response.
Where do you see democracy as most under threat around the world right now?
It's most under threat in places where this axis of autocracy, China, Russia, Iran, are pushing out. Cuba is also a very malign actor in our hemisphere. The regime in Venezuela continues to exist despite overwhelming opposition from its people because of active Cuban material support. So democracy is under assault. This is an opportunity for the United States. Billions of people around the world are our allies. They don't want to live in authoritarian countries. They don't want corrupt leaders not answering to them. So it's a real opportunity. It's also a real vulnerability for America's enemies. I've been personally sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party alongside Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio. IRI separately was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party and the same list as the US Navy. Why would China equate IRI and the US Navy on their threat vector? Because these dictators, including in Iran and other places, and China for sure, they are afraid of their own people. If the US can provide modest support to help people make their own choices, speak, find their voice, stand up for their own rights, that is an enormous vulnerability to the enemies of the United States.
Let's actually focus on Iran for a moment. You've written that the current weakness of the Iranian regime is an opportunity for the Trump administration. You've called on Trump to use a kind of combination approach of maximum pressure using sanctions, maybe even U.S. military moves, combined with increased support for democracy activists inside Iran. Help me unpack here what you're advocating for, and how do you see a best case scenario playing out vis-a-vis U.S. policy toward Iran over the coming years?
Iran is an amazing opportunity. I mean, thanks to our friends in Israel, the Iranian regime is weaker. It was weaker before the October 7 atrocities because it had been subject to the biggest street protests since the 1979 revolution as part of this women life freedom movement that sprung up in Iran over the past few years organically. Iranians hate their government. Iran has fake elections where they weed out all independent candidates. So it looks like an election, but in fact, the whole thing is rigged and predetermined. Iranians in 2009, when President Obama took office, tried to peacefully bring about democratic change in their country, the Green Revolution. President Obama took the side of the Ayatollahs because he wanted to get this nuclear deal. President Trump came in, did maximum pressure, and it produced results. The Iranian economy was shrinking, Iranians agitated against their leaders, but of course, he left office and the campaign did not last. There is a real opportunity in Iran. Our IRI polls, or it's amazing we can poll in Iran, but we can, show that most Iranians want to have a normal relationship with the United States. 80% of Iranians feel like their government is completely out of touch, does not speak for or represent them. Iranians are looking for a new deal. The Iranian Ayatollahs know that. This is a great opportunity for the United States peacefully to do maximum pressure through sanctions and other forms of inducement, but also to support the people of Iran and their aspirations. If Iranians could bring about some kind of democratic change, think about the security problems that would solve for the United States in the Middle East, vis-a-vis the Iranian threat to Israel, vis-a-vis the axis of resistance with Iran supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Iranians do not want to live in a country that is a terrorist state. They want a government that answers to them.
Daniel Twining, so interesting, so insightful. Thank you very much for joining the Threat Status Influencers series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.